Lovely to see you all. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all to this seminar today here in MoLI. My name is Eoin O'Neill. I'm Director of the Earth Institute in University College Dublin. We seek to promote interdisciplinary environmental, climate and sustainability research. We have a really diverse audience here today. His Excellency Ambassador for New Zealand to Ireland, Trevor Mallard, you're very welcome. Civil and public servants across government departments, state agencies, politics, farmer organisations, think tanks, academia and more. So you're all very welcome to this session. This series is part of a Democracy and the Environment series in the context of this being a very significant election year globally. So we've already seen with over half the world's population going to elections of significance. So we've already seen the UK and French elections. We'll see the US presidential election in November, and we'll have our own general election looming sometime soon. Climate change, sustainability and climate transition will be part of that conversation whenever it takes place. So this series ongoing seeks to facilitate a space for collaboration and conversation between research, politics, policy and society. And this session will focus on finding ways to make the Irish dairy sector a leader that combines commercial success and global climate and ecological leadership. So special thanks to Frank Convery in particular for spearheading this session, and to Antonio Soler from the Earth Institute for making today possible. Also like to thank our contributing speakers today. So Professor Frank Convery, Darragh McCullough, Joe Leonard, Alice Doyle, with this session being chaired now by Damien O'Reilly. So Damien is his European Affairs and Communications Manager for the Irish Co-Operative Organisation Society, which he joined in November 22. Previously, he spent 24 years as a broadcast journalist with RT Radio 1. Before leaving media, Damien presented Countrywide, an award-winning farming, food and rural affairs programme. He also worked across other areas, including news, sport and current affairs. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Damien.
Thank you very much, Eoin, for that lovely introduction. Good morning, everybody. Great to be back home. I was home for the weekend, so it suited perfectly when I got the invite from Frank to actually chair this discussion that we're having here today. And it's great to actually be chairing an event that's not just full of kind of people in an agricultural bubble, but it's great to actually be at an event where people, you know, from outside the sector can contribute and maybe learn a little bit more about what's going on farms. And we have 3 farmers. I'm certainly not a farmer. I did grow up in that well-known farming region of Castleknock in West County Dublin. But I was lucky enough to spend my summer holidays on my granny's farm. Both my parents are from the countryside, so it gave me, I suppose, a great grounding to where I've ended up today. After studying journalism in Ballyfermot, I got my first job in local radio a long time ago, and then I joined RT in 1998. And I was put into reading farm news, of all things. I certainly didn't think that was the career path that my journalistic studies would actually take me. But as one wag put it at the time, as far as RT were concerned, Castleknock was a way out in the countryside, so I was perfectly fitted for that job. But as I said, it took me across the country, and I think I had the best job in RT for 24 years, going around the country, talking to ordinary people about farming and rural life, and making lovely programmes as a result of it. But then in 2022, as Eoin says, there was a sliding doors moment, and I was given the opportunity and grabbed the opportunity to move to Brussels to work with the Irish Co-Operative Society, one of the oldest organisations in the country, founded in the 19th century by Horace Plunkett. ICOS has had an office in Brussels since we joined the EC in 1973. And I really do believe that you know, the co-op model is one that we should be nurturing more and more now than ever before, and maybe that's a conversation for another day. But I'm working in the busy and bustling metropolis that is Brussels, and I'm actually absolutely loving it. Now, when I was leaving RT, I'm not a clairvoyant. I didn't have a Renault car to hand back or nothing. I didn't see what was coming. I'm not able to predict the future, but it was my instinct that told me it was time to change. It was time to do something else. It was time to take a risk. And risk is something that farmers, arguably more than any other profession, take every single day. As a farmer's decision to take a risk today will not probably bear any fruit, or the outcome will not be known for maybe 2 or 3 years. weather, produce demand, prices, market volatility, and unforeseen global events, and we've had a lot of them, as we know, in recent times, they stand in the way on a daily basis between a farmer and their paycheck. Farmers, as we know, are price takers. They're not price makers like most of the rest of us. And they usually work from dawn to dusk, avoiding more policy landmines than any of the rest of us do in our daily jobs. So the title of today's conference is The Business Case for Developing Ambitious Climate and Water Quality Outcomes for the Irish Dairy Sector. And here is another question, I suppose, that we can pose today. Is it policy or practice that will actually deliver on that? We are at a very critical juncture, I suppose, when it comes to policy, because we have a brand new EU Commission. We've had EU elections with a whole new bunch of MEPs, and they're the people that shape and debate and deliver on policies in Europe that affect the daily workings of food production right across the EU. There's also a new CAP budget to be decided and a new looking CAP policy to be developed in the next couple of years as well. Of course, the ambitious EU Green Deal remains intact and on target. However, the changing of the guard in terms of the political landscape across Europe, becoming more right-wing, as we know, that cannot be ignored in terms of the smooth rolling out and delivery of crucial climate targets between now and 2050. The Green Deal aims to make Europe the first carbon neutral continent in the world, and agriculture and other industries have to play their part in that regard. The Strategic Dialogue on Agriculture has just reported, and time will tell whether or not that initiative, instigated by the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, will hold any water or not. But it is a peace accord of sorts between the environmental pillar and farmers and food producers. It is important that there is no more polarisation, and that's what I can see in Brussels. We need to decarbonise, and we also need to obviously limit the impact on climate change, but we must continue to protect food security and food production and the production of safe, traceable food across the EU. Both challenges are not mutually exclusive, and the days of finger pointing, we really think, should end. Therefore, policy needs to protect the three pillars of sustainability: environment, economic, and social. And that is at the centerpiece of today's discussion. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the real stars of today. We have two presentations. One of them is a joint presentation, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and we'd be delighted for you to get involved as well. So I'll welcome to the stage now a man who needs no introduction, Darragh McCullough. Of course, Darragh is a well-known broadcaster, presenter of Ear to the Ground, and of course a farmer by day as well. And his farming partner is Joe Leonard, and Joe is a dairy farmer with in partnership with Darragh, and of course also very involved as he is on the board of directors of Nuffield Ireland. So Darragh and Joe, I'll welcome you to the stage to give your presentation. Thank you.
Very much, Damien. Thanks, Damien. I think he said that Joe was my farming partner. It's more like I'm Joe's farming partner. Joe is the man that gets up in the morning and is hunting cows and actually making the milk flow. I have my own farm where we concentrate on cut flour production, but we milked cows on my farm until about 2006, and I was distracted running around working full-time in media, and my dad wanted to step back, so we quit milking cows, but couldn't shake the disease, so to speak. And when the opportunity arose with the abolition of milk quotas, we formed a partnership with Joe in 2014. So 10 years ago this year, myself and my dad brought 120 acres of land, 60 cows and some sheds to the mix. Joe had 540 cows, an experienced team, impressive cost control, and a kick-ass milking parlour. So Joe's team does all the work. Myself and my dad check in throughout the year, and Joe is going to take you through the details of the farm. Joe.
Thank you, Darragh. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. So as I've been introduced to Joe Leonard, I'm a dairy farmer. So if you don't know, we're in East Meath, so we're just off the M7. City North Hotel is probably our talking, our identification point. If you see any cows walking across the motorway bridge around there, morning or afternoon, they're usually ours. So, well, they're better be ours, they would not be anybody else. So a brief history. So I've come from my father started dairying in the mid-70s. We had a dairy and beef farm right through to the mid-90s. And I suppose our first change, or our first economic reality, was come towards the end of the 90s after the foot and mouth, or the BSE crisis within beef in Ireland, and then coming into the early noughties with the foot and mouth crisis. We found we were running two farming systems, two bits of land, roughly the same size businesses. One in beef, one in dairy, and one was making about at best a quarter of the profits of the other one. So that was our first economic reality. We turned that beef farm into a golf course, which my brother now runs. So it's a separate business, but it was I suppose our first real economic shock. I then focused fully on the farm. Mid-noughties, I mean, we're in Quota, Ireland, so there was no opportunity for expanding our production. So we had to put in a system of cost. It was just a matter of, we had X amount of litres of milk we could produce. So that was the limit to the income of the farm. So the only way of making more profit was trying to drive down our costs. So that became our primary focus, and the primary focus of the majority of dairy farmers in the country during the quota period. I think 2008, 2009, Europe decided they were going to start getting rid of quotas in 2015. That, for me and for a lot of Irish dairy farmers who'd spent decades been restricted in their business ambitions. That's when we started looking at really how we could grow the farm. So we were milking about 200 cows in 2007, and we put plans together for, we reckon on our own existing land we could milk 350 cows. Then 2 years before quotas went, we started, Darragh and myself, or Darragh and his father and myself and my father, started discussions as to how we could grow a business. So that's when the partnership formed. And so we started 1st of April 2015, officially when milk quotas went. That's when the limits were removed from Irish production, and we could. So the farming system. So at the moment we're milking on a farm platform. We have 264 hectares in total on 3 blocks of land. We have 5 different landlords. So technically, between myself and Darragh, we own about 65% of the milking platform. The rest is rented in. And if you take Darragh's off, it's somewhere about 55% of what we are personally on our side of the family own. So it's a collaboration. We've had to collaborate to have the opportunity to grow. We're currently milking between 550 and 600 cows. We did peak at 625 a few years ago, but we found it was just becoming too unsustainable. This year we milked about 560 cows, and we're looking, probably the way climate and things are going over the last few years, producing cow numbers a little bit more. We run what we call a spring calving system. So work is front loaded. We calve everything late January, February, March. Cows go out to grass as quick as they can. It's a predominantly grass-based diet. So from about 85% of the cow's diet in dry matter terms is grazed grass or silage. The other 15% comes from a boarding concentrate. Our cow type would have been a Jersey cross, New Zealand crossed Frisian cow. So typically small, very much designed for dairying, rather than a dual purpose cow. We were following the science. We followed the advice of Teagasc over the years as to which way we should lead our cows to production wise. So that's the farming system. And I suppose the reason we're here today is it's more to look at, I suppose, what we've done on the climate side, how we've tried to help. So I suppose we've always farmed within the nitrate derogation. When the nitrate derogation came in 2007, 6, 7, was it something? We applied for the derogation that year, and we've been in it ever since. So we've, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, I suppose, as the topic of climate change has become more pertinent, as it's reached farm level, we've done what we can ourselves, some at our own cost, some our own initiative, some driven by legislation. And some just by good economic, I suppose, policy, whatever else. So I mean, the cow we've bred is the EBI, the Economic Breeding Index, is the way we rate our cows within the Irish system. So our cows are in the top 2 or 3% of breeding worth, whatever, within the country. So they're high quality genetic, high genetic animal. They've been designed for the grass-based system so that they're highly fertile. They produce good quality milk solids on a relatively low diet other than just grazed grass. So we have the good quality cow, and we followed all, when you look at our energy usage, we went down the solar route this year. Darragh's gone down the solar route a few years before. We have all the stuff that's recommended, all the variable speed milk pumps and the heat recovery units from when we're cooling the milk. We use that to heat the water for washing the milk tank and everything else. We use all the low emissions slurry spreading. We use protected urea rather than CAN and nitrogen. And over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've started growing a good bit of multi-species sports, not just clothing sport, but actually up to 8, 10 different varieties to try and improve not only our soil health, but to try and gain a hybrid vigor, for want of a better term, out of the soil. We first started doing this discussion group I'm involved in. We went to South Africa in 2016 and we started growing very effectively there. I came back in 2017 and planted the first of it and made a complete mess of it, to be honest. It didn't last very long. 2018, we had, some of you remember, certainly within a farming context, we all remember it wasn't the best years for farming, between the beast from the east in the spring to one of the longest droughts we've had in a long time. So it was a tough year, so we didn't. But since then, we've reseeded 40 to 50 acres of the farm each year. So we're about 40% of the milking platform, 33% of the farm grown with multi-species sports. So I suppose from a climate mitigation point of view, the big thing of that is the clovers and the legumes within those sports reduce the amount of chemical nitrogen needed. So on those sports, we use about a third of the amount of chemical nitrogen that we would on the conventional grass sports. So those are a lot of the mitigation measures we've made on the farm. And I suppose what we find in, between Darragh and I, certainly when Frank asked us to speak here, is, how do we measure these? We're putting in a lot of these things. I mean, the climate mitigation, we found, even with the multi-species sport, there is a reduction in the amount of grass we produce. Yes, we're reducing the clover a lot, but we are taking a hit in the amount of feed we grow. So that changes it has an economic effect on the farm as well. I mean, Teagasc recently estimated there was a 3 cent a litre. Sorry, can you?
Yeah.
Is that better? Sorry. There's half of you not heard me. Shall I start again? No, I hope not. Sorry. So yes, how do we measure? How do we quantify, or what can we do? And there's nothing. I mean, the only one we have, I suppose, that's anyway quantifiable at the moment is the board beer. We do a board beer audit every year or every 18 months for production, but they have a climate sustainability measures within that. And over the last 3 audits, we've been looking at our results.
It's a thing like this, just a 3 or 4 page document. Yeah.
Yeah. And it gives us, I mean, along with lots of stuff, it gives us a result of our production of CO2 per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk solids produced on the farm. It's quite a mouthful, but it's basically how much CO2 per kilo of milk solids comes off the farm. So our first audit that I've gone back through, well, we've had audits before, but I couldn't find the results, but back to 2019, an audit in 2019, which was taken for the year 2018, our results was 0.94, 0.93 or 0.94. Subsequent years, the last audit we did was in December last year, so that was in 23, but it was done for 22. And our audit at that stage came back with 0.74. I think it was not 0.78, it's 0.78, sorry. So that's we got between 16 and 18% reduction in our CO2 emissions per kilo of milk solids over the last 3 to 5 years. We feel we're doing a pretty good job on that. You know, the baseline average, they say, that comes on the report for 500 to 700 cow herds is about 0.94. So we started the baseline average, we're about 15 to 18% better. But when it comes to our nitrate mitigation, which is the one that's actually more topical within, I suppose, Irish farming at the moment, you know, and managing our waterways, we've gone through all the measures that we've been asked to put in place. And Darragh was going to go through some of them too as well, but we've changed the camber on the water on our roadways so that they all lean away from anyone that run along the edge of ditches, whatever. They lean back so that any runoff runs back into the field. It doesn't go towards the ditches. Our GPS with our fertilizer spreading, so we keep away from the ditches. Our slurry spreading, we keep the buffer zones. Cows, you know, all the ditches and waterways have been fenced. Cattle can't get into them. You know, we've increased our slurry storage capacity to make sure we don't have any excess runoff through the closed periods. But as Darragh and I were chatting, we have very little way of knowing what that does for us or what it does for our local waterway. You know, we're not being tested on a per farm basis. We're not even sure. I mean, Darragh's done a lot of work, and he'll go through those in a minute now on to find something in our local streams and rivers. You know, so it's very hard for us then to know do these mitigation things, measures that we're putting in place, do they help? Are we, you know, and the majority of these have been done. And, you know, out of our own pocket from the farm. They're not, you know, okay, the solar panels, this year we're putting them in, we're getting a grant under the town scheme. But pretty much everything else we've done has come on our own initiative. So I think that's a good overview of where we are as a farm and what we're doing. I'll give you Darragh to analyse a bit more.
Great job. Thank you, Joe. So Joe's giving you a whistle-stop tour of the farm. Is it better me on this or that? This. Yeah, okay, Grant. Before Frank approached me to talk to you here today, slightly embarrassed to admit this, but I didn't really know what river the farm was what river catchment the farm was part of. You could have a guess, but nobody had kind of ever come out and said, listen, you're part of the Delta River catchment. I now know that. Didn't know what the nitrogen loading in the local river catchment was. I now know that it is between 4 and 5 millilitres of nitrogen per litre, which is almost double the target level set by the EPA. So the EPA have a target of 2.6 mils per litre. And okay, if it's 4, we're 50% higher, and if it's 5, it's nearly double. But I wouldn't know any of this information. Only I had Donald. Where's Donald Daly? He's down there somewhere. There he is, down at the back. Basically reached out to me as one of Frank's contacts and gave me a bit of school and dug up a whole load of data. We don't know. So when I looked at the numbers, and as Joe says, we have Donald's data went back to kind of 2014. All the mitigation measures that we've been rolling out in the farm over the last 5 or 6 years have had pretty much zero impact on the level of nitrates in the river. Now, what do we take from that? Is it that the farm is still polluting the river? Or is it that we weren't polluting the river in the first place and the changes we've made weren't that necessary? Or is it that, you know, every other farms in the area or other villages in the area, I know our local village is Smullin, and the population has boomed in the last 10 years. And depending on which day of the week, you might find a big sewage tanker down there parked up, sucking out of the local water treatment system. So we've no impact. Before a month ago, I didn't know what river catchment we were draining into. I didn't know the nitrate levels in the river catchment. We still don't know what impact the farm is having on the nitrate levels, and we don't know what else we can do to further drive a lowering of nitrogen levels in that river. It's not a great starting point for a country that, you know, we hear it and we see it on the news all the time about the environmental crisis we have, the problem with our water quality, and the impact that agriculture is having on it. And I like to think that myself and Joe are pretty informed farmers. Yeah? If you take the spectrum of farmers out there, Joe has served on the Nuffield board for years. He's travelled the world. He's very modest about it. He was one of the first farmers to bring multi-species swards into Ireland 6 or 7 years ago. And just in case it got lost in all the figures he was trotting out there, it more than halves the fertilizer requirement on that area. And as a result of the success of, now they're not a silver bullet, I mean, they have their problems, but the multi-species swards, so many farmers have looked at what Joe and his compatriots in the discussion group have done, and now there's thousands of hectares of multi-species sward being grown in Ireland, and with the resultant drop in thousands of tons of fertilizer being required. None of that, when Joe came back, he knocked on a couple of doors looking for a little bit of funding, a little bit of help, a little bit of advice on going forward with that, because it was a risk, yeah. None available. So no policy, no support, no advice, right? He took the leap anyway because he thought it was the right thing to do, and he's proved to be right. But another figure that we learned in the course of getting ready for today was our nitrogen utilization efficiency number. Have I got that right? Nitrogen use efficiency. Yeah. Yeah, that's how familiar I am with it. So we now, Joe punched in the numbers into the Pasture Base app, which is an online app, and it shows that our NUE figure is 28%. The target is 35%. The national average is about 25%. So the target is 35, the average, national average is about 25, and we're at 28. Neither myself or Joe could stand here and tell you what we can do differently that will really move the dial on that number. So we didn't know what river catchment we were draining into. We didn't know the nitrate loading in the river. We don't know the impact of the farm on the nitrate loading in the river. We don't know what else we can do to shift the impact. And we don't know how to improve our NUE number. I've kind of gone off script a bit here. I suppose the nitrogen situation is kind of just one example of an overall absence of an overall action plan to deal with what we're being told is an environmental crisis. So we talked about multi-species swards, how there was no support for that. Joe mentioned he's using protected urea. There's no policy out there that says, lads, you should be using protected urea. There's a rule in place that you must use it, or there's a subsidy to encourage farmers to buy protected urea. Why not? I don't know. It's a no-brainer, but again, an absence of policy. And I feel that we're some of the lucky ones, right? We have a farm that has scale, we have good land, we have good knowledge about the system. But no wonder, if we're in a vacuum, no wonder there is frustrations out there amongst farmers who feel they've been backed into a corner and given no real way out. I'm going to finish up, I think, with a couple of clips. I'm going to switch my farmer hat for my ear to the ground hat. So I've spent 23 years reporting for Ear to the Ground, and the frustrations and the vacuum of information and ways forward goes way beyond just dairying. I'm going to play a couple of clips from just the last 2 years. How do I get into this now? Where am I supposed to go here, guys? Is Antonio in the house? So there was a few clips there somewhere in the file earlier. You know, Apple computers.
Okay, here we are.
Oh, lovely. Okay.
Do you know which one it is?
Yeah, well, sure, we'll play. So the first one is a farmer who planted forestry 30 years ago, but found that he couldn't harvest his trees because of objections. And people often wonder why farmers don't turn to forestry to solve all the world's problems. And yes, we've never needed more afforestation, and yet tree planting is at record low rates. And here's an example of why. Let me see if I can play this now for you.
In 2018, Pat applied for his felling license. The Forestry Service got back to me and said that they needed some additional work done. My stand borders on the River Wye, it's a sensitive area. I would have been aware of that. I'm very respectful of that. So
Sensitive from an environmental point of view.
yeah, well, it's in a special area of conservation.
After applying for his felling license, Pat had to submit an environmental impact report. 1 year later, his license was granted. Within days, however, 2 people appealed against it on grounds of its impact and inappropriate environmental assessment.
Oh, yeah. So what he goes on to say there, sorry, I had another clip, but what he goes on to say is, listen, I followed all the rules and got my license, but because of objections, I'm now held in limbo. And, you know, this was 30 years after investing in the crop. And, you know, farmers aren't doing this for sport. They're investing money with the expectation of being able to harvest money at the end of the period. And so it's stories and situations like that that are scaring farmers off from forestry. Okay. The next thing that I often get asked about is, well, why don't farmers turn their land to renewable energy? Now, I'm not going to go off on a tangent here about the merits of carpeting some of the best land in the country with solar panels, right? That's a different day's discussion. But even when a farmer sticks them up on his shed, like I did, and has been exporting electricity for over a year, and there's a legal obligation on it and the energy suppliers to pay people for renewable energy, I haven't got a red cent. And I just mentioned that by way of kind of highlighting that the system is struggling to cope and facilitate farmers to do the right thing. It doesn't stop at solar. We have the highest capacity per capita in Europe for generating electricity from anaerobic digestion, but we have one of the lowest number of digesters in Europe because policy won't let developers get on with it. So now we're faced with the prospect of importing biogas from France. A little clip. Hopefully this plays.
Can I ask, is there any way to make this picture bigger?
So I'll give you, yeah.
Oh, double click. Yeah. Okay.
On mute. French biomethane producers will be selling biomethane to customers here in Ireland. If we do not get our act together, we are not going to be able to compete with them as we progress later on in the decade. But if the French can do it cheaper than we can in Ireland, maybe we should just let them send their biomethane over to us. Sure, then Irish agriculture will miss out yet again on all the opportunities which AD offer. And I think whenever Irish farmers are really being pressed hard to reduce emissions on farm, I think it would be a sin to allow French farmers to avail all of the emission reduction benefits that AD offers.
I also had a little clip of a farmer talking about that if he lost his derogation for dairying, that he would drop 10 cows. And I asked him, so how much is that worth to you? He says, well, and so it's a touchy question to ask a farmer, but he was brave enough to stand up on national television and say, look, I make about €1,000 out of every cow. So if I'm losing 10 cows, I'm losing 10 grand. And I asked him the question that a lot of non-farming folk ask if they're ever thinking about this subject, which is, well, could you not turn your hand to something else if you're finding that your income from dairying is falling away? He said, I'm after investing $500,000 in the last couple of years in building a parlour, developing my herd. I am where I am. This is what I can't just turn around over the course of the next 5 years and spend another $1 million turning my farm into a tillage farm. So those are the guys that end up out on protests because they feel like they've been backed into a corner, that they're not being given an option of protecting their income. And you know, they put blood, sweat and tears, a lifetime of effort into building up an enterprise and an income, to be told, listen lads, your farm, your operation is a problem and you're going to have to take a hit. So that's about as much as I have to say on that topic for now. I'll be delighted to answer questions after, but for now I'll hand over to Damien or to Frank. Damien, there you go. Yep.
Thanks very much for that, Darragh. Okay, so we're going to move on now, and I am delighted to indeed welcome to the stage Professor Frank Convery, who's going to talk us through the title of his presentation, which is titled Policy Choices That Will Deliver Outcomes at Scale, From Brutal Realities to Global Leadership. So you're very welcome. Of course, Professor Convery is Emeritus Professor of Environmental Policy at UCD and a member of the Food Vision 2030 Task Force. So you're very welcome, Frank.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed those presentations enormously. I must say the best learning is the learning by doing, and it's terrific to see two great doers having a go, and the lessons I think are tremendous. I'm going to try to convince you of a few things. One is that there are commercial reasons, very good reasons, to address vigorously the climate and the nitrates water quality issue, and that it needs a change in our policies if we're going to succeed. So I'm going to spend a good bit of time on three challenges. One is the whole carbon footprint competition. Joe elaborated on how it's been improved dramatically on their farm. And my proposition is that the rest of the world that we're competing with is driven largely by very smart policy, reducing their carbon footprint dramatically. And that number that they show, 0.78 in their case, is going to be in a few years' time a really important indicator out there in the marketplace, because it tells consumers this is the amount of CO2e when you buy your pound of butter, this is what it means in terms of climate impact. We basically have to change what we're doing and how we're doing it to be globally competitive. And I focus in particular on our three markets. The biggest one is the EU, the second biggest is the UK, and the third biggest is the US. And what's happening there, that will determine whether we're competitive or not. And the final part is really to talk about the policy shape that we need to be competitive. So that's what I'm about. I'll talk a little bit at the very beginning about my story. It sounds a bit Trumpian, me. And speaking of Trump, don't we have the biggest crowd ever to be seen at a meeting at the UCD Earth Institute? So let me see if I can get the technology right. Yeah, why is this happening? It was driven initially by listening to Joe at a meeting talking about he was selling daffodils to the Dutch. And I said, a guy who does that is got some serious qualities, courage/madness. He takes action. And of course, there's tremendous strategy, as we've seen and heard, about how they think things through. And also, of course, he has a terrific interest in the public interest. I'll talk about my story, the challenges I mentioned, and then the policy story. My story really begins in UCD with Seamus Sheehy, who was a kind of mentor. And Seamus had great courage, really, in talking. In fact, a lot of it was around the quota story. But he marshaled evidence and he went into the public square, basically, to talk about it. So that was an interesting model for me, and it encouraged me to go to the States. And when I was in the States, of course, you become completely, I'm trying to get the balance between wearing glasses and not. Right here. I think it makes much more sense to look here. And the key point was the last one, really, which is you see, if you go to New York these days, you'll see it on the subway everywhere. If you see something, say something. And Seamus had this idea, if you see something, you should say it. And that was a key impetus for me. Another one comes from the US as well, and it's the realization that premium prices exist and that they matter. 8 days ago, I had a look at the Walmart website. They're the biggest grocer in the world, as you know. And for the same product, Kerrygold basically commands a 42% premium for a pound of the same kind of butter. And Janet and I used to buy stuff in the States a lot, and we were there for 4 years. And it was a constant source of pride and surprise and interest that this premium exists. And that means premium consumers exist. And if you look at the people who buy Kerrygold in the States anyway, looking at them, they were all much richer than I was, and most of the American public. So it's rich people with tons of money and almost infinite choices that we're selling to. And that leaves, what does it take to hold on to these people? Because they're clearly crucial to the economy of the Irish dairy sector. And my proposition is that if our carbon footprint is wrong, then we have a problem. If it's right, build on the terrific image we already have. The woeful quality of the debate is another reason. I quote Damien here from his Irish Farmers column. And he was talking about an Oireachtas committee, but he said there was no discussion ever about real tangible solutions to agriculture emissions. Parity of esteem needs to reply, and so on. Without both, we're all doomed. I think that's a tremendous statement because it captures the essence of the challenge. Food vision was also a huge impetus for me. Tom Arnold, who chaired that committee, is with us. But we basically, our kind of endpoint vision was to become a world leader in sustainable food systems. And I signed up for that, and having signed up for it, I felt a responsibility to do whatever I can do to deliver it. And that's what part of the motivation for what we're about here. Now, turning to the challenges that I mentioned, the carbon footprint one, I spent most of the time, but the other two, derogation, we've talked about. The cost, so these are, one is a price problem. If we get the carbon footprint competition wrong, there'll be a price sag. If we lose the derogation, there'll be a cost problem, as Darragh was pointing out. The third one is interesting, which I came on recently, and this is there's quite a bit of thinking now about what it'll cost us if we don't comply with the effort sharing regulation. Most of our emissions are in the effort sharing regulation basket in agriculture. And it turns out the costs that we will have to pay for missing that are high. So I deal with these three. This is the emissions of total farm is interesting. You see it's gone from 547 to 606, showing decline towards the end of that. But the last three are the footprint. And these are all from the sustainability reports of Teagasc. They have three estimates of the footprint. The first one is the life cycle one. It's 1.06, 1.82, and 0.84. So you're measuring different footprints. You'll see that they're all higher. These are for the average farm in Ireland. You can see if you look at the last column that they're all higher than the Joe's farm, basically. But the reason I gave the three estimates is that what the markets choose to use to measure the climate impact of product is going to vary in terms of methodology used. I love Andy Grove for reasons, but only the paranoid survive is his famous observation. And the point really is the new force that there is now in our key markets, proactive mission-focused policies that are reducing emissions and improving their footprint. So the world is changing out there, and the proposition is that we have to change to match what we're going to be encountering in marketplaces. I love Gretzky's observation. He's a famous ice hockey player. Skate to where the puck is going, not where it's been. The future is not going to be like the past. I move on to start dwelling on what the key markets are. If you look at the EU row there, you'll see that we're selling 36.2% of our dairy output to the EU, 16.7% to the UK, and 10.7% to the US. Our total exports last year were 6.36 billion. If you add those three, you get about 65% of that total, 4 something billion. So that's where the action is, in those three places, and that's where the competition is coming from, where we come from. And my point is that there's a lot happening on the policy front that will be driving emissions reductions and therefore reducing carbon footprints in those three markets. The US is fascinating at two levels. In California, dairy farmers are being paid directly for performance. They get subsidies on the supply side to reduce, and on the demand side, then they can sell methane credits into the carbon intensity of fuel policy. So they get two revenue streams. And both of them are directly calibrated to performance. In other words, they get paid for reduction, the amount of reduction. And also they have a huge parallel problem, policy on carbon removal. And they're spending a lot of money in California. At the federal level, the federal government put in 20 billion in the recent budget for climate smart farming. I'll talk a little bit later about the Alliance for Farm Organizations that drove that. And now there's a big new initiative to drive innovation and methane removal at scale. So their policies are driven by smart policy and now by a huge R&D and innovation effort to reduce methane. For us, the problem there is, of course, that money, that outcome will be perfectly suited to indoor containment type farming and not suited to our grass-fed type farming. So that creates a competitive disadvantage. The last thing on the list there, methane sat, is interesting. I worked for the Environmental Defence Fund as chief economist for 4 years. While I was there, they put together 120 million or so to launch a satellite to measure methane in granular detail. It went up this February, and it's going to start producing results in the new year, basically in the first quarter of 2025. The reason it's interesting is, of course, that it actually measures emissions and concentration. It's not going to be based on algorithms. And secondly, it can be able to both aggregate small sources and obviously identify big sources by geography. So that's a new American initiative that I think could completely transform the kind of evidence and then therefore the debate. This is the result of the Californian policy, and the policy is a pay for performance policy. And since they introduced it, started it in 2015, 16, emissions have fallen by about 10%. If you compare from 2018, so we have, and by the way, California accounts for 19% of their total milk production. So they're reduced by 10% to 2018. Irish farming has to reduce by the local law emissions by 25%. So what California has done in that window, they've already done it by 10%, and they're continuing to reduce. It will be amazing to me if they don't turn that into a carbon footprint in California on the backs of butter sometime in the next few years. This is interesting, and it relates again to my old employer, the Environmental Defence Fund, because the farmers, co-chaired by Zippy Duval, who was the president of the American Farm Bureau, got together with Elizabeth Gore as co-chair, and they basically put together a package. This is before the last presidential election in the States. They came up, and the negotiations were hard and very challenging, but eventually they agreed a portfolio of actions to support farmers decarbonize. And that essentially was just cut and pasted into Biden's budget in 2022. So that alliance essentially created a pipeline of big money for the American farmers in this space. The National Milk Producers Federation are working with the NGOs as well in the Farm Bill, which they're working on for this coming year. And that's to provide a wall of money for science and for farmers to reduce methane emissions from farming. So the point is, the American ship, with all its travails politically and so on, is really moving in a very strong, interesting, and ultimately, I think, pretty effective way to be carbon competitive. In member states, France has, from 2018, again, this is people who've done it already. they've introduced a program where where farmers get paid basically for reducing emissions. Again, its payment is directly related to performance. And the name of the program in French is carbon. Labeled carbon, labeled back carbon. So they use the word label, so they already have internalized the idea of putting a carbon label on something. And these farmers basically get paid for reduction, and they created a guaranteed revenue flow because they, by law, domestic flights in France, the airlines have to fly net zero domestically, and they have to buy allowances to make up the difference between their emissions and zero. Fossil fuel plants, of which there are very few in France, but there are some, they similarly have to be net zero, and they have to buy offsets from farmers. So they've created a price market, and they've created a grant. So it's very like the States, actually. California, Californians grant the farmers to help deliver, and they also pay them per unit of delivery. The same is true in France. Denmark is more interesting in many ways. The biomethane that Darragh showed, the Danes, of course, have been the European leaders in biomethane reduction. And as a result of that, of course, they have what they claim is the best carbon footprint in Europe now. That's the second bullet that I talk about there. Very cleverly, they're collaborating with California, of course, because they're compared from North America, and so on. So I'm just making the point that there's a lot of action happening out there in our key markets to reduce emissions and to reduce carbon footprint. New Zealand is intriguing at several levels, and it's wonderful to have our ambassador, their ambassador to Ireland with us. And they, first of all, unlike us, on the policy side, they're obliging participation. So it's not opt-in, they're obliging participation in levy payment on emissions. However, that's been deferred from 25 to 30 with the change of government. They have huge success, and like ourselves, in carbon removal. And they're also, I think, on the innovation side, MoLI's approach seems best suited to grass-fed systems, and they're ahead on that. Fonterra, which of course is the huge company on the milk side, they announced at the end of 23 the ambition to maintain our position as one of the world's lowest emission suppliers of dairy scale. They've committed themselves to a 30% intensity reduction in greenhouse gas by 2030. They have 4 channels for doing that: best practice, novel technologies, carbon removals, historic land use change. And they're using the SBTI as the verifier. So the reason why, of course, New Zealand is directly relevant to us as a competitor is that they have a free trade agreement now with the UK, which will allow free access. The volume will increase to the point where there is no constraint. And of course, this will be steered by Fonterra. And of course, they will be obviously pitching their carbon footprint as a key selling point in the UK market. This raised some problem. I should say that I'm a forester from early days, as I mentioned earlier, so I have a deep affection for trees and the whole forestry business. So that's a declaration of interest, I suppose. But it's interesting that Fonterra see carbon removal contributing 8% of their 30%. In other words, a quarter of their As Darragh pointed out, and as is part, forestry is at the moment dead man walking in Ireland. So at the moment, that New Zealand model of providing a quarter of the emissions reduction / carbon footprint reduction is essentially not happening. So that's to me that's a big competitive narrative for the dairy industry. That's struggling. This everything I've said up to now, I think, is well known. Really, I'm just aggregating evidence and views. What I think is very interesting and important, as I see it, is geography. And to the 9 co-ops that are essentially supplying most of Ornua's milk product. And the question is, will each of them have their own footprint? So in the case of Darragh and Joe, what's the aggregate footprint for Lakeland Dairies, for example? So if Lakeland Dairies is selling into some of these markets with a branded product, what's that number going to say, and how competitive is it going to be? Ornua, of course, and I think we have Dave Fitzgerald here with us, and he could talk to this, but Ornua then is a weighted average, of course. The big challenge is, so we heard about the farm activity, and this relates to nitrates as well, which I'll come to in a minute. But the challenge that Joe and Darragh had, they're bringing down their footprint very, very well. But if the footprint for the product that they're associated with may end up being not. So the logic that has big logic for designing policy, which I'll talk about in a minute. The challenge at commission level, of course, it's the key requirement for the, I listed 3 requirements from the ICOS website. But the key requirement is that the higher nitrogen limit is not and will not contribute to higher pollution. And the fact that we haven't contributed, the corollary of that is to hold on to it or to get back even, is to reduce the level of pollution. And the spatial thing there comes in directly because Darragh talked about the Devlin, which is his catchment. And the big question mark about how much their farm contributes, how much all dairy farms contribute, the measures that could be introduced to essentially change it. The trajectory actually of the Devlin isn't going up, but it's bouncing more or less flat. And there's this gap that Darragh pointed out. So if they are to guarantee holding on to the derogation, probably it needs to begin to fall. And the question is, how does that be delivered? I had a look at the commissioners, the designated or the candidate commissioners that van der Leyen has nominated. And Jessica Roswall, the Swedish politician, is the environment commissioner. Her responsibilities are environment, water, and resilience in the circular economy. So I would say, I've worked with a lot of Swedes, that the quality of the evidence and the quality and coherence of the case is likely to be critical in terms of decisions that come out of the derogation challenge process. An interesting thing that Donald Daly actually compiled using data from the EPA work is the in-stream end load reductions in specified catchments. to meet the 2.6 litre threshold that Darragh mentioned. What I find fascinating here is that it makes the enormous case, I think, for very geographical specific policies, because a few catchments are very close to complying with the 2.6. Others are some distance away, and a few have huge challenges. So I think from going back to Jessica Roswell, the case to her, I think, needs to be the ones where we have a chronic problem. We're not going to get anywhere close to 2.6, but we can change the trajectory. For the ones who are almost there already, I think, well, I think I have a slide on this. Yeah, I'll get back to the delegation issue of the players. So this is the third challenge. And as I say, I just came on it recently. The effort sharing directive covers the emissions that are not in the trading scheme basically. And ag is by far the biggest share of this. Our legally binding obligation is a minus 42% reduction by 2030. And the model that the union had, the flexibility mechanism that provided by the system, is that countries that are overshooting, in other words, that aren't delivering minus 42%, they can buy reductions from other member states that are doing better than that. The trouble is that all the data is showing that a lot of countries like ourselves are going to underperform or overshoot in terms of emissions. We're going to have to buy allowances from other countries. And this is Irish work, but this interestingly, there's European work that comes up with almost the same numbers. That's going to cost us, it's a state-to-state transaction. This is the Irish state will be buying from the states. Is about 3.5 billion, well, 4 billion. So in other words, with existing measures is with existing policies. The effort sharing regulation estimate is that we'll have to spend about 4 billion essentially to buy ourselves out of the problem. And of course, that's a huge amount of money. And the attraction to me of it is that we should be able to go to the Department of Finance and say, look, we're going to have a big bill here. Wouldn't it make a lot of sense to spend maybe half that money upfront addressing the challenge, as opposed to drifting in to buying ourselves out of the problem and still having the problem domestically? So this slide really is talking about the, just look at the 22, I have 29 slides, and this is number 22. So if you want to calibrate your attention, this is where I'm at. The evidence is compelling that if you want to succeed, you have to have a mission focus on the problem. In other words, greenhouse gas emissions are the problem in climate. And unless policies directly supports reducing those, you're not solving the problem. And secondly, you need innovation as well, of course. So the criteria is cost effectiveness, deliberate focus on the challenge, addressing the constraints, long time horizon. And in the Irish context, my strong argument is that we need funds additional to existing measures, including CAP. So what I'm talking about is new policies that are in addition to the existing mix we have. That's essentially in parallel with the common agricultural complex. And the last point gets to the co-op challenge and the geography, because I go back to the footprint issue. Each co-op needs to compete on footprint, and they need to, I think, get policies that are channeled to the co-op and to the farmers within the co-op in a coherent and effective fashion to deliver the outcomes. At the moment, our policies tend to be almost all individual farm based and all opt-in. And that means that the chances of all that aggregating into competitive performance, I think, is pretty low. So that's the geography thing, and it's a fairly radical change in how we do stuff at the moment. And of course, the key is to learn from best practice in Ireland and from around the world. I think it's interesting to look at policies in Ireland. I just in one of my blogs, I go through several of these, but this is just one example. The decarbonisation of the existing housing stock. As most of you will know, we did 50,000 units last year. So it kind of resonates with farm because there's a lot of farmers, a lot of households. We need policies. The policy instruments mix that's being used, there's 6. There's information, the energy, the BER building energy ratings, of course, is mandatory. And I think is a fantastic instrument because immediately you have a number that says this is how this unit is performing in this space. Of course, we have subsidies and we pay for performance. As you know, if any of you have done these grants, you don't get the grant paid until an independent certifier says this is what's been invested and this has been the outcome in terms of the grading. In our house at home, for example, we went from a G to a C. This was very disappointing because, of course, a B3 makes your house very attractive to borrowers to buy your house because they can get better rates in the marketplace and so on. But the carbon tax, of course, is a stick because we're all paying it for the fossil fuels that we're using. Innovation, for example, external wraparound has dramatically changed the game. And regulation, as we know, new dwellings have much higher standards and so on. There's a dedicated organization, a dedicated budget, and time. So it's interesting, the government is now coming to an end. At the beginning, they said, look, we're going to ring fence 5 billion from the carbon tax to drive this particular agenda. We're going to do it over 10 years. So you have guaranteed money and you have a timeline that makes sense. And then, of course, you have the co-benefit issue of capital appreciation, the cheaper mortgages, and so on. So I suppose this is just a little illustration of that. It's very, I think it makes a lot of sense to look back at other policies that are working more or less and say, what can we learn from them? There's a tremendously rich policy instrument mix available, which I plod through in my one of my policy blogs and how they work. You need a mix of them in every case. For example, tax expenditure, if you look at number 2 there, that's essentially the technical name for tax breaks. And you can look at all of the tax breaks that the Irish Exchequer gives to people. And if you say, I mean, it's just out of the air, but an assessment really needs to happen. Go through each of those 11 instruments and say, how could these be designed to help farming to essentially compete in terms of carbon footprint? It's a challenge for the system. Looking at nitrates, again, Donald Daly brought this to my attention. And these are the number of existing measures that are available to reduce pollution. The H1 is a sobering one, of course, that's high, because reducing land units per hectare, in other words, destocking, is the highest way of doing it. But there's a whole stream of others, obviously. under the other measures that are all listed there, they're all low, but there's also medium and so on. So I think the challenge that Darragh put on the table really is, what does the HML mean in terms of actual output performance? And what does going from an individual farm to, say, an aggregation around, in their case, their catchment, the depth of catchment, what does that begin to look like, and so on? So there's quite a fit, I think, between what an individual farmer is facing and what the policy system needs to work at to just lift the aggregate performance of that farm, but it have other farms, so that the water quality can improve. That's really crucial. And that's the other geography, because I talked about the catchment geography, but there's also the catchment, the river catchment space, and those are crucial strands. These are a few personal reflections. Separated the area. No, it's in the jigsaw. But Darragh was probably 2.6. You know, how is that shaped? Yes. This is for rewarding farmers and co-ops and credible evidence. Okay. That standard and so on, and we continue. And I personally think that some kind of system of derogation, think about the gold star and say about attachments essentially with the world that you can see. Silver star. Which would be for farmers showing farmers the catchment, farmer to impact. Those are just I'll just put it finished now. The prize is obvious. Compared carbon footprint, about nitrogen emission and reducing general. So those are commercial type challenges. And I like the California one. California essentially invite tenders from the cold and the country loss and tell us what you do in terms of money, logistics, so and address the nutrients issue. And these would be evaluated in the California model by economy. So that would be, and then we have their reason and those co-ops and farmers who come out with the other things that you need to learn about farmers that system policies. One of the subsidy laws that others talk about. And innovation is a section of innovation. And it allows you to introduce you to new ideas. The non-ag sectors, the EU has a model where auction revenues are traced a year. Transport and also on the chickens to the farm. But the climate usually is quite significant. One of the main factors with the rich as the world is based on Chinese and cold. And part of this is it's a wall. Something so one is they have worked through this nation. Of course, they were inventing Lego. But the point is to argue as a theory, just sit around. Wrong, and of course, perhaps is true focus for the world. Finally, I just like to give a shout out to Chagas. Chagas, of course, since 2013, so claim to do, but actually produced our first sustainability report showing what we were doing. But the farming sector was doing, and of course, I was very impressed by the so this slide is supposed to be thank you. Awesome. Here now, and I'd invite Joe and Darragh back, and also Alice Doyle is the Deputy President of the Irish Farmers Association. Very welcome. So thank you, Alice. I'd like to take a seat. Just listening there, I don't want to spoil people with facts and figures, but as they do the events and conferences that I would be at, we're in a room full of farmers and people associated with agriculture. So we assume they know everything. But just to give you a little sense of the Irish dairy sector, 17,000 dairy farmers in Ireland, 55,000 jobs, worth 17 billion in the economy.
just from a co-op's perspective, I think it's important to say that I have slide deck, it's too late to actually put up here, but you're more than welcome to contact Frank. It's just a collection of slides that I came across showing the amount of work, the world of work that's going on in all of the co-ops that you referenced around the country to help farmers decarbonise. And in Darragh and Joe's own co-op, for example, Lakeland, just the name of the reference, they have a scheme at the moment called Farming for a Better Future, Protecting Our Waters. And there was a farm walk earlier this summer in County Longford. Over 250 farmers were on it. There was a model farm showing what's going on that farm to actually protect water. It's Lakeland is committed to reducing by 30% their carbon footprint from milk production by 2030 with regenerative agricultural practices. And 90% of suppliers, including Darragh and Joe, are engaged in the 5 cent a litre or 5 pence a litre, because they're cross-border business sustainability program. So that's just one example. In Lakeland and all the other co-ops as well, there's the Target 8-point program, which was obviously published earlier this year as well, to support farmers to improve water quality. And there is the Department of Local Government, Housing and Local Government, Union Department, and the Department of Agriculture put together a fund of 60 million euros to joint European Irish initiative to support 15,000 farmers in the Slaney catchment area to improve works on their farm again to improve water. Just a final point as well, water quality is a huge problem all over Europe. There's no point in being the best or worst, but you will get the impression maybe from some of the commentary that Ireland has the worst water in the world. It's actually, in European terms, we're in the top 3 or 4. That's nothing to brag about. It's just worth actually saying. According to Yale University, Ireland is in the top 1% for drinking water quality. It ranks as the world's best for drinking water quality. That's a slide I have on that deck as well. It's a recent Yale University publication. So there's also been visits from the EU Commission last week. They were here for 3 days, engaging with all stakeholders, visiting farms from DG Envy, because it is the EPA and DG Envy, Department of Agriculture and farmers that must work together to improve water quality, and by the end of 2025 to convince with statistics and science, convince the EU and other EU countries that's why Ireland should be allowed to continue with the derogation of 220 kilos. Anyway, I've added along. Alice, I'm going to hand over to you because we haven't heard from you. What's your, response to what you heard this morning?
Thanks, Damien. Very interesting listening to the farmers, because I too am a farmer. I'm a practicing farmer. I'm also a consumer, and I'm also a deputy president of a farming organisation which lobbies locally, nationally, and at European level for farmers and for what they need to do. So, wearing all of those hats and listening to the speakers before me, I can identify with an awful lot of what they're saying. When I listen first, just listening to Joe talking, he is a proactive farmer. He represents an awful lot of farmers in Ireland who are proactive about doing the best they can with their farms to produce that good quality food that we must produce, and has been the underlying, I suppose, pin in the European Union since 1956. We produce good food. So we produce that. But we also must produce clean food, and we must produce it for in a good environment. So that's where Joe is coming from. And he talks about, doing the right thing on his farms, and talking about instinctively doing the right thing, and also using knowledge that he's learned by being abroad and whatever, and using the best technologies available to him. When we come to Darragh, I listened to him talking about water quality, and the majority of farmers are very similar to what Darragh said. They do not know what it's all about, what all this water quality is about. It probably came to a peak in Ireland when we started discussing it, when it came about derogation, and it got linked with derogation. So suddenly water quality became a big issue. And I think people sometimes forget that they think it's just for dairy farmers that, water quality is a big issue. It's for every single farmer in the country. And Darragh is absolutely right in saying that I would say a very high percentage of farmers have no idea what water catchment area they're in, what the water quality is like. They have no notion, I suppose, of the fact that they may be damaging the water, but they're not intentionally damaging. They just don't know they're damaging and what their contribution of damage may be, and maybe very little or none in some cases. they may actually be contributing to the welfare of the water and making it very good. So I think we have to look a little bit farther down the line of policy, which I just mentioned in a minute. So we can identify that those farmers, I think, are there where Darragh is, and they're learning. We are learning pretty fast. Just then going on to Frank, then Frank really, gives us like a global picture. And again, identified a couple of things when he was talking there. A couple of things came to mind. He was talking about our competitiveness in an international market, where we are. And we listened to Board B, and I just came from a meeting last night where Board B had a presentation about the work they're doing in selling our origin green, product. And Darragh showed one of the forms there that we fill in when we do our QA with Board B. And we have a good footprint, on an international level. We have to improve it, and we have to retain it and improve it. So it is becoming a question among consumers. Are we producing food in a very good environment? And therefore, we have to make sure that our quality assurance is good. So, and that includes water, and it includes emission, our emissions, reducing our emissions. So all of that fits in. And I really like when Frank was talking, I think it's slide 27, Frank, when you go back to look at it later on, you were talking there very much about the things that we can do. And something that really hit me really, really clearly there was, you talked about the price we'll have to pay if we don't meet our targets, for carbon, for our carbon footprint. And really, instead of, spending that on buying back, paying the penalty, it would be a very good idea if the joint of thinking would spend that on getting, on improving our footprint here, rather than having to pay for the mistakes we made. And again, if I can just continue that with a couple of things, listening to to everything. I just identified that here, the whole idea of where we want to go. It's like being given a target destination. What we have to do as part. We have a target destination, we reach a certain level of emissions, etc. That's the destination. But we've been set off with a very poor map, with very poor tools, and very poor direction as to how we're going to get there. We're really willing, we're all, on our bikes ready to go, we're all on our farms, on our tractors ready to go to do the right thing. But we need the help along the way. Now, I do see a lot of, green shoots helping us. There are a lot of good things happening. And I don't want us to think this is all doom and gloom. Farmers are doing a huge amount at the moment. Food Vision, the dairy food vision, which you spoke about, Frank, too, also mentions all the different things that we could have been doing. Joe has mentioned all of those that he's carrying out on his farm. And that's a number, but there are many, many more that other farmers are carrying out all around the country. And then we have the whole water section where you have Teagasc, we mentioned the water program for Teagasc, the ASAP programs, we have the catchment areas, we have, and we even, the EPA have recently put up on their website now the PIPs, where any farmer can go in now and check what's the water quality in his or her area.
Fertilizer sales, according to the CSO, are their lowest in 24 years, year on year down again by 20%. So, the multi-species sward is a great alternative to that. So I tell you what.